Hi, everyone. Um, my name is Chanel van der Merwe, and thank you so much for being with us today. I now have the privilege of introducing Professor Yasir Suleiman to you. Yasir Suleiman is Emeritus Professor of Modern Arabic Studies at the University of Cambridge. He has published extensively on language, identity, and conflict in the Middle East. He has been made Commander of the British Empire by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II in 2011, and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh since 2001, and an Honorary Fellow of the College of Physicians of Edinburgh since 2013. Until recently, he served as President and Provost of the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar. Prof. Suleiman, it is an honor to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you, Magda. Thank you, Simfree, for the invitation. I thought I'd include my CBE, Commander of the British Empire, since this is a post-colonial forum. I thought I should remind you of colonial times. And I'm actually honored to be invited to join you. I'm going to read my presentation. I hope you don't mind this. I'll do it slowly. And later on, this can be shared if you wish. This has been published recently, but I thought it would really serve to introduce the overarching themes that I would wish to put in front of you. And also, I hope it would be a good starting point to excite and ignite discussion afterwards. So the Middle East and North Africa is one of the most conflict-ridden regions in the world, with 90% of all states participating in at least one violent conflict since the end of the Second World War, or since becoming independent, against a ratio of 64% worldwide. The causes for these conflicts are complex and varied, but language is not one of them. However, these conflicts are played out on the international stage through intermediary languages, mainly English as lingua franca, in ways that draw our attention to the importance of linguistic contestation. In this respect, it does matter to the parties concerned in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whether the media refer to Jerusalem as occupied, annexed, united, contested, captured, or conquered. These are all terms used in the media, particularly the British media. According to the Palestinians, Jerusalem is occupied, relying, among other things, on the legality of international law in staking their claim to the city, as promulgated in United Nations Resolutions 147 and 242. 147 was in 1947, and 242 was in 1967. Basing themselves on fait accompli as a deciding factor, the Israelis consider Jerusalem as annexed, united, and some in fact claim it to be liberated. The international media, when they are trying to be balanced, refer to the city as captured instead of occupied or liberated, and contested instead of annexed or united, jettisoning international legality for a notion of balance in reporting that evinces an ethically suspect commitment to fair play and even-handedness. More daring media outlets may brand the occupation of Jerusalem as an act of conquest, to signal acquisition by force in a nod towards occupation that avoids highlighting its decidedly negative meanings. The BBC is a master of this kind of linguistic gymnastics, as its coverage of the tragic events in Gaza in May 2021 revealed. In newscast after newscast, it reported that the attacks and counterattacks led to hundreds of deaths, adding, between inverted commas, most of whom are Palestinians. The fact that the percentage of deaths was in the region of 25 Palestinians to 1 Israeli was occluded by the formulation most of. This is an example of how the media in certain situations tend to pay lip service to the truth, using language to avoid and dissemble while relieving their professional conscience or protecting themselves against the charges of biased reporting. Less obvious is the expression the West Bank and Jerusalem, which the international media used to refer to the area under Jordanian rule which Israel occupied in 1967. This expression is now used in Arabic translation by the Arabs, even by the Palestinians themselves, without realizing that it advances an Israeli political claim that considers Jerusalem not to be an integral part of the West Bank. The West Bank was occupied in 1967 and Jerusalem was part of the West Bank. We are talking about East Jerusalem here, with the old city as its locus, which was part of the West Bank when the Israelis occupied it in the Six-Day War of 1967. The expression Six-Day War itself used to be contested, being referred to initially as the June War or the setback Naksa by the Arabs, although the Arab media have largely abandoned these terms in favor of the Arabic equivalent of Six-Day War, Harb al-Ayyam al-Sitta. Terminologically, the Arabic term Naksa, which means setback, was coined by the Egyptian media to rhyme with the Nakba catastrophe of 1948 in Arabic. The Nakba of 1948 is the deciding factor in what is for the Palestinians is the loss of Palestine, which ended with the dismemberment of Palestine and the creation of the State of Israel, called the War of Independence by the Israelis. On the 50th anniversary of the Naksa in 2017, so on the 50th anniversary of the Naksa in 2017, young Egyptians on the streets of Cairo were asked what they thought the term meant. Very few people knew the answer. Some thought it was the name of a musical group. Such is the loss of memory in modern Arab society. The name of one of the greatest Arab defeats in modern history has dissipated into the musical ether. While language may not be a cause of conflict in the Middle East, it is important instrumentally in the prosecution of conflicts. It is used to advance one's own narrative at the expense of the other side. This is blatantly reflected in the choice of code names for military operations. And the Israeli military have proven themselves to be the true masters of the war of nomenclature in the Middle East, realizing that the effective prosecution of war on the military front requires an equally effective war on the linguistic front. Let me give some examples. Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which led to the Sabra and Shatila massacre of thousands of innocent Palestinian refugees on 6 September 1982, was given the code name Operation Peace for Galilee. Galilee is the northern part of Israel. The 1996 invasion of Lebanon was given the code name The Grapes of Wrath, the title of John Steinbeck's novel, first published in 1939, evoking Revelation 14:19-20, with its reference to divine justice and deliverance from oppression. The massive Israeli bombardment of South Lebanon in 2006 for harboring Hezbollah forces was called Operation Just Reward. These names evince a narrative of peace, justice, and freedom from oppression, which requires meting out punishment to the enemy who deserves his just reward for attacking us. Delving into history, invoking God's presence, and declaring a commitment to prosecute peace through war, these code names, as carefully constructed speech acts, are intended to win the audience to one's side. Winning the war is not complete without winning the hearts and minds of those who stand in the middle by acting on their feelings, religious convictions, or knowledge of history through the deliberate use of language. While instrumentality is the primary function of language in ordinary life and times of conflict, attention must also be paid to its symbolic role in society as a subject of extra linguistic meanings. And here again, we may turn to historical Palestine for data. Right from its early beginnings in Europe in the late 19th century, the Zionist movement faced the question of language in its full symbolic force. Instrumentally, it would have been easier for pragmatic reasons to choose Yiddish, the language of Central European Jewry, as the medium of communication in the much hoped for national home for Jews in Palestine. But this was rejected because of its negative symbolic meanings as a sign of the diaspora, which the Zionist movement was seeking to annul. Instead, the Zionist leadership opted for Hebrew, practically a dead language among European Jewry in daily interaction, because of the symbolic resonance of the language in laying the claim for Palestine and enacting a narrative of continuity with the ancient past. So important was language in pressing the Zionist claim, it in fact formed part of a Zionist triad that incorporated land and labor to underpin the call for return to Palestine, whereby the Jews would reclaim the land through exclusively Jewish manual labor with Hebrew as the medium of communication. The revival of Hebrew which followed in Palestine was therefore a nationalist project in which symbolism was initially more important than instrumentality. And it was a project doomed to enter into conflict with Arabic, the language of the Palestinian Arabs who formed the absolute majority at the time. To this day, the linguistic landscape of the streets of Old Jerusalem provides a palimpsest of this conflict. During the British Mandate period, which extended from 1920 to 1948, the streets of the city appeared in a trilingual form, with English as the language of the ruling power appearing at the top, followed by Arabic as the language of the majority population, including incidentally the indigenous Palestinian Jewry, and Hebrew as the language of the minority. This is an example. If you look at this example here, which still stands outside the walls of East Jerusalem, the old city of East Jerusalem, you will see that at the top, you read English Nablus Road, and then after that you have Arabic, and below that you have Hebrew. It's quite interesting because the official language, English, occupies a larger space of the street plaque. Then Arabic occupies a smaller one, and then Hebrew after that occupies a smaller still. And it's quite an interesting plaque, this one. I wish I could show you more of it, not of this one, but copies of it in the same area. It's quite interesting because in fact, you can see the effect of conflict on it. If you look here, bottom left, you will see bullet holes. If you look under the B in Nablus Road, you will see another bullet hole. And if you look under the S, you will see another bullet hole. And then you will see the effect of shrapnel all over this road sign. So this road sign itself narrates a story of conflict. This trilingual arrangement was contested by the leaders of the Zionist movement in Palestine and London, who unsuccessfully petitioned the British authorities, demanding parity among the three languages by displaying them horizontally on all street signs. They said the vertical organization of the three languages does not give Hebrew the same status as Arabic in particular, but also English. And they demanded that three languages are arranged horizontally. And the old streets of Jerusalem do have one or two, I think there are two examples of horizontal arrangement of the three languages, but we don't have time to go through those. During the Jordanian rule of the Old City, which extended from 1948 to 1967, street signs appeared in Arabic and English in that order. Hebrew was erased, but some of the old mandate signs were preserved, like this one here. providing a flashback to a prior linguistic order. What's really important here is that you don't actually have to be able to read what these languages are telling us. All you need to know is that there's English at the top, Arabic underneath it, and Hebrew underneath it. And what really matters here is the vertical arrangement of these languages. So following the Israeli occupation of the Old City in 1967, and more so since its formal annexation, sorry, let me just show you one from the old period, from the Jordanian period. It is this one here. If you look at this, this is inside the Old City. This is quite an interesting road sign, because if you look at the middle part of it, you have Arabic, and then English is underneath it. And the Arabic and the English are together in one frieze, inside one box. And there's no Hebrew whatsoever. After 1967, the Israelis came, and then what they added a layer on top of the Arabic. So you can see that the Hebrew stands at the top with its own box that is superimposed above Arabic and English. So in a way here, what we have in a sense here, we have an archaeology of the conflict inside the old city, in the streets of the old city. During the Jordanian period, Hebrew was erased, and Arabic now occupies the coveted top position, and English is beneath it, underneath it. And then after 1967, the Israeli authorities come and then put Hebrew at the top of the roadside. Acts of erasure of Arabic and Hebrew from the street signs are found in this landscape to deny the claims of ownership of the other side. The picture is in fact more complex, but this will suffice to show that, in addition to being used as an instrument of circulating politically inflected terminologies and ways of talking, language provides an echo chamber for political conflict through its role as a symbol that conveys extra-linguistic meanings. Here, language acts as a proxy for concerns that pertain to the world of politics in its broadest sense. The conflict in this case is not over language per se, but about what language stands for symbolically in the world of politics and in international law. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If you look at this here, it's quite an interesting one, because this is the road sign as you'd have seen it during the Jordanian period, 1948 to 1967. You have Arabic at the top and English at the bottom, but there is no Hebrew. After 1967, the Israeli authorities that ruled over the city came and superimposed a Hebrew part on top of the what you see. And if you actually look carefully at this, closely at it, you will see that this part, the part that was added at the top, has in fact been removed. You can see its place, it has been removed. And you see quite a lot of this inside the old city. Palestinians will go around the streets, removing the Hebrew, and you'll see also Israelis, particularly outside, going and then covering the Arabic writing on road signs, or crossing it out. So you have in the streets of Jerusalem, you have Israeli Jews going around trying to erase Arabic, and you have Palestinian Arabs going around trying to erase Hebrew. Now, this is not really a battle over what language says, what language communicates in the semantic sense of the term communication, but about what language stands for. It is not a battle over the instrumentality of language, but a battle over the symbolic load of language, what language stands for in the extra-linguistic world. It is about who has power, who has authority, who rules, who commands the place, and then acts of resistance. You see these quite a lot in the old streets of Jerusalem. Language erasure for symbolic reasons was also a primary factor in the loss of Arabic among the hundreds of thousands of Jews who immigrated to Israel from Arab lands during the early years of the state. Let me just explain to our audience. Now, after Israel was established in 19, most of the people who came to Palestine before 1948 came from Eastern Europe, mainly from Poland, from Russia, from Latvia, from those places. They came from Germany. They came to, so they were European Jews called the Ashkenaz in Israel. After 1951, after the establishment of Israel, there was an influx of Jews who came to Israel mainly from the Arab countries, principally initially from Iraq. So tens of thousands came to Israel from Iraq. They were, in a sense, almost expelled from Iraq by the government at the time, and they came into Israel. The Iraqi Jews knew, some of them knew Hebrew as a liturgical language, as a religious language, but their mother tongue, their language that they used in Iraq was Arabic. Lots of writers came from Iraq into Israel, and some of them continued to write in Arabic, and then they converted into Hebrew. So these, what they called Mizrahi Jews, came into Israel with Arabic as their primary language. And I want to talk about not just Arabic and Hebrew colliding with each other along the Arab-Israeli fault line, but I'm talking here about Arabic and Hebrew colliding with each other inside the Israeli fault line, inside the Israeli-Jewish fault line. So language erasure for symbolic reasons was also a primary factor in the loss of Arabic among the hundreds of thousands of Jews who immigrated to Israel from Arab lands during the early years of the state. For these Jews, called Mizrahim, the active renunciation of Arabic, leading to its loss, was considered a necessary stance in becoming a fully fledged Israeli. The implication being it is not possible to achieve full national status and integration in society without severing one's links to the language of the diaspora, in this case Arabic. But Arabic is not just any language of the diaspora for Israelis. It is the language of the enemy outside who threatens the existence of the state, as well as that of a politically suspect and socially underprivileged and stigmatized fifth column of Palestinians who remained in their land, who would refer to it euphemistically as Riblad after the establishment of the state. In fact, the Ashkenazi leadership of the Zionist movement, being at the help of the new state, was at pains to distance it from its Arab-dominated environment, fearing that the influx of Mizrahi immigrants from this environment carried with it the danger of orientalizing Israeli society. So when Iraqi Jews, Moroccan Jews, Algerian Jews, Egyptian Jews, Syrian Jews started to come into Israel, the Ashkenazi leadership of Israel felt that Israel as a European project was going to lose its Western dimension. And they set about trying to almost encouraging people to erase, nothing, almost putting pressure on them, demanding of them to lose Arabic in order to become fully absorbed and part of the national body politic of Israel. Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, who was born in Plons, Poland in 1886 and died in Ramat Gan, Israel in 1973, feared these immigrants' primitive Arab mentality. The fear in Israel at the time was if these Arab Jews don't lose their Arabness, then the primitive Arab mentality that they brought with them will permeate Israeli society. So it was very important that these Arab Jews be de-Arabized and lose their Arabness as well. Abba Eban, who was born in Cape Town, South Africa in 1915 and died in Tel Aviv in 2002, and who served as Ben-Gurion's Minister of Education and Culture from 1960 to 1963, reiterated the same stance when he said that these immigrants could, and quote, could drag Israel into unnatural Orientalism. So it was very important that the Arabness, at the helm of which is the Arabic language, is erased, is lost, so that Israel does not turn into an Oriental society. It remains true to its, as it were, Zionist original idea of being an extension of Europe in the Middle East. And this explains the use of proprium controls, mechanisms of disapproval, ridicule, or ostracism against any display of Arab background by these immigrants, and especially by their offspring. In his book, Outsider in the Promised Land, published in 2006, Nassim Rajwan, who calls himself an Iraqi Jew in Israel, in the subtitle of his book, dubs this stance the Levantinism scare, or the Orientalism scare. There was a scare, Orientalism scare in Israel, demanding that Arab Jews lose their Arabness, and particularly the major sign of that Arabness, which is the Arabic language. The erasure of Arabic among Mizrahi Jews from Arab lands, called Arab Jews by Israeli sociologist Yehuda Shanhav, was a desired goal for the new state for symbolic, identity-linked reasons, although the need of the state for Arabic instrumentally for critical security reasons was supremely paramount. What I want to really say here is that Israel was at war with its neighbors. It really needed Arabic in order to be able to find out what's going on around it. So having a high level of Arab instrumentality, Arab competence, or not Arabic competence was important for its security and survival. In spite of that they still demanded of their Arab Jews who knew Arabic to lose their Arabic to become fully Israeli citizens, to become part of the national body. So there's sort of this paradox. Your security needs demand that part of your population continue to know Arabic as best as they could, but the symbolic needs of the state as a European project demand that that Arabic be lost. And within about 1 generation, 2 generations, Arabic became almost extinct amongst these Arab Jews, except in music and except at home in ethnic gatherings, turning Arabic amongst these Arab Jews into a kind of kitchen language. Let me just give you another example of the symbolic importance of language in conflict. You'll see that what I'm really trying to say is that linguists in particular, linguists spend a lot of time, sort of what's called theoretical linguists, descriptive linguists, a lot of time talking about language structure and all of this. And they seem to sort of pay little regard for the ethnic, political, national, social, tribal positioning of language in society. And my main thesis is this, is that in order to get to that position in society, what we need to do is to acknowledge that the most important function of language is instrumentality, but then also recognize that its symbolic value is the one that is most important, or one of the most important things to attend to in trying to understand how language works as a marker of identity and how it gets embroiled in conflicts in society. Let me give you another example to try to sharpen this analysis. This example is based on a novel by Anton Shammas. Anton Shammas is a Palestinian Israeli writer. He's a Maronite Christian who comes from the northern part of Israel, from a small village. Anton Shammas, he actually works now at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He left Israel. He wrote a novel in 1986 called Arabesque. And in this novel, Anton Shammas tells the story of the Palestinian Nakba, the loss of Palestine as the Palestinians see it. But he doesn't write it in Arabic or in English. He writes this story, this novel, in Hebrew. And Anton Shammas had an incredibly commanding knowledge of the language in its historical context. So the novel relates a Palestinian story of loss, of expulsion, of losing losing control over sort of the land and over sort of destiny. And he tells it in Hebrew that is soaked with references from the Old Testament, from the Talmud, and different periods and eras of Hebrew literature. And this novel, which was published in 1986, caused an uproar in Israel. The Israeli public were astounded by the quality of the novel, by the quality of the language, the narrative, but at the same time, they were repulsed by the fact that it told a Palestinian story. And Anton Shammas was attacked in the press for this act, this daring act. It was an act of huge daring for a Palestinian to write the story of the loss of his land to the Israelis through the language that the Israelis considered to be an emblem of their identity, in this case, Hebrew. And to tell it in impeccable Hebrew, Hebrew that is full of references to the history of the Jews and from the Old Testament and other sort of eras. Now, Anton Shammas had a project, and his project was extra-linguistic. He felt that Israel defines itself as a Jewish state. He felt that a democratic state must not define itself in ethnic or religious terms, that he was fighting for Israel to become the state of all its citizens equally, and for the state to be equidistant from all the citizens of the state. And he called his project through Arabesque as the unjewing of the Hebrew language, unjewing of the Hebrew. So Hebrew is no longer sort of a sign of identity for the Jews only. In Israel, it's a sign of identity for all the citizens of Israel, be they Jews or Palestinian Arabs, whether they are Muslims, Christians, or others. He was attacked for this, attacked for the fact that he told a story of Palestinian national suffering and loss in the language of identity for the dominant Israeli Jews in Israeli society. And when I was doing my research on this particular chapter in the encounter between Hebrew and Arabic, and also Arabs and Israelis, or Arabs and Jews in Israel, I interviewed Aleph Bet Yehoshua, who is one of the best known Israeli novelists. He was born in Palestine in 1936. I interviewed him in 2012, and I asked him what he thought, because he was one of the main people to attack Anton Shammas for writing in Hebrew. And Yehoshua said to me in the interview that he disagreed with Shammas. Shammas should have written his novel in Arabic. Shammas is an Arab, he should write in Arabic. He is not a Jew, and therefore he should not have written his novel in Hebrew. And he said, the two literatures need people, Palestinian literature and Israeli literature, they need the writers to write in their national languages. And then we can leave the question of cross-fertilization and interaction to translation. So translators then can translate the novel from Arabic into Hebrew, or from Hebrew into Arabic. So for Yehoshua, he believed that there is a question of one language, one people. Arabic and Hebrew are in conflict with each other, and the Arabs should stick to Arabic and the Israeli Jews should stick to Hebrew. And when I asked him about Iraqi writers in Israel who were still writing in Hebrew, like Samir Naqqash, he also thought that was wrong. Samir Naqqash wrote about 12 novels. He's an Iraqi Jew who immigrated to Israel. He wrote about 12 novels, all in Arabic, and never wrote in Hebrew. And Yehoshua was saying that Israeli writers, regardless of their earlier linguistic background, should write in Hebrew, and Palestinian writers should just stick to Arabic and then leave translation to work on transferring one literature to the other. Now, just to also look at language and conflict here, so again, from the point of view of symbolism, now when Israel was established, Israel kept the status of Arabic as an official language of the State of Israel, which was the case under British rule. There were several attempts between 1948 and 2018 to try to annul the official state of Israel of Arabic in Israel. And in 2018, these attempts succeeded, and Israel, on the 19th of July 2018, passed what is called a basic law, which has a constitutional status, declaring the state of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, who alone have the right to exercise national self-determination, Article 1. And then most of the other articles really talked about the name of the state, the flag, the emblem, national anthem, capital, official calendar, Independence Day, memorial days, just all symbolic matters. And then when it came to Arabic, it then annulled the official status of Arabic in the state of Israel. And the reason for it is that this status was felt to be inconsistent with the establishment or with the declaration of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people alone. So Palestinian citizens in Israel cannot have an official status for their language in the state of Israel, as was the case under the British and in earlier periods in Israel. Now, the attack against, well, the Palestinians read that as an attack. The removal of the official status of the state of Israel is not a question of the instrumentality of the language, because the language is still used in the educational system amongst Arabs. It's used in the media, it's used in the press. The attack wasn't on the instrumentality, communicative capacity of the language, but it was on the symbolism of the language. The fact that the Palestinians see it as a marker, as an emblem of their own national status inside Israel. So that was the reason. It was there was no reason for instrumental reasons to remove the official status of Israel, the official status of Arabic in Israel. And my final point is that when you look at the situation in Israel, you need to read it semiotically. Language is a semiological system. It is one way of communicating amongst other ways of communicating. We all know about traffic signs, we know about traffic lights, we know about other ways of communicating, we know about body language and all of that. Now in Israel, Palestine, there's a huge fight over other symbols of identity, what I call symbols of banal nationalism. And in this case, food. I just want to talk about food. Now, the Israelis, and I'm sure that in the States, you all think that you're all eating Israeli hummus and Israeli falafel, because falafel and the hummus are known in the States. I know this to be Israeli. Even couscous, I have menus from American restaurants declaring couscous to be an Israeli food. So there's this battle about items of material culture, in this case, food. So is the falafel Palestinian or Israeli? Is hummus Palestinian or Israeli? Is knafe Palestinian or Israeli? Is labneh, other items of food? So there is this semiological battle over sort of other emblems of material culture that have come into the fore. And these battles have been reflected in postcards. So let me show you a postcard. This is a postcard, it says falafel, Israel's national snack. And you can see that there is a flag of Israel in the middle. Now, the Palestinians thought that the Israelis haven't just taken the land, they haven't just declared, they've made the language unofficial, removed the status of the language as an official language. They have taken the falafel, the hummus, they've turned them into Israeli food. They market them as Israeli food. Even couscous now is marketed as Israeli food. So they countered, of course, they contested this, as they have done on the street signs of Jerusalem. Exactly the same thing, street signs of Jerusalem. And you can see this in this here. So they have taken that postcard. They said falafel, Israel's, they crossed it out, national snack. And they put the Palestinian flag. Now the question is this, of course, when you ask Palestinians, why didn't the Palestinians write falafel, instead of crossing out Israel and showing the act of crossing here, just write falafel, Palestinians' national snack. The Palestinians will say there's no point to say this because everybody should know, must know that falafel is an Arab food, it's a Palestinian food. But you could see that if you walk through Jerusalem, you're always constantly seeing signs of identity drawn from nature, drawn from food, material culture, being used in order to stake the claim of one party against the other, and then the other party comes and then contests that claim, as we've seen in this postcard here. As also, we have seen it, you remember that one here? Sorry, you've seen that one here. There's an act of contestation here, exactly as you have it here. Sorry, as you have it here. Now, just to show you another, not postcard, but another picture that, or another image that gives more support to my point, it is this one here. Now, during the Intifada in 1987, in Palestinian occupied territories, the Palestinians pressed items of material culture in order to promote their claim, this is our land, this is our culture, and you're just occupying us, please, just not please, do leave us alone. And they used time. For example, there are about 2 weeks in Jerusalem itself, the old city and the new city of Jerusalem, the west and the east, during March, when the time zones are different. So if you are on the eastern side, it would be 3 o'clock, on the western side, it would be 4 o'clock. And time itself has been politicized. And when the Israeli soldiers used to catch a Palestinian, keeping Palestinian time during the Intifada in 1987, they would take their watch and smash it, because they knew that this was sort of using culture as a soft power to resist the occupier. Now, United Color of Benetton, is it United Colors of Benetton? Yeah, United Colors of Benetton heard about this. So they actually had a booklet talking about colors and the use of colors amongst Palestinians and Israelis. And this image here is one that is taken from that brochure, that leaflet. It's not leaflet, it's really like a small booklet, about 30, 40 pages with images, full of images and advertisements for Benetton. Now, this is quite an interesting one here. You see a watermelon, and this watermelon was during the Palestinian Intifada in 1967 used by the Palestinians as a symbol of identity. The Palestinian flag, if you go back here, you will see it has green, it has white, it has black, and it has red. So Palestinians would be sort of walking in the streets of Jerusalem or in Ramallah or elsewhere, going past Israeli soldiers, not carrying a full melon, but carrying half a melon or a quarter of a melon. Because the melon on the outside is green, in the inside, and the inside is red. There's a rim which you can see is white, but all melons in Palestine, they're all full of seeds. It's only recently, last 20 years, that I've known about seedless melons. Our melons are very full of seeds, and the seeds are black. So what you had, the watermelon became almost like a Palestinian flag, communicating to the other side that this culture is our culture, this place is our place. So I'm carrying a watermelon, I'm getting from the shop back home, I go past an Israeli soldier, and I'm telling him, this is Palestine, get out of here. So what I want to say is that language is part of this semiological conflict over signs of identity, whether they're material culture or even made-up culture. The importance, for example, of the olive tree in this fight. So just to try to conclude, what I'm trying to actually propose to you is that while it is, of course, natural and normal that we spend a lot of time thinking about the instrumental communicative role of language and spending time as professional linguists, describing these languages, their structures, their phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and also talking about them and the brain and all the rest of it. It is really important to spend a bit of time thinking about language and society. Now, sociolinguists, of course, have done so for a long time, since the 60s, and Arab linguists have sort of engaged in that. But they've always engaged it from the, well, not initially and to a great extent, from the position of language and society as an instrument of communication. And I'm trying to shift our sort of gaze a little bit and say, we need now to start to talk about the symbolic values of language in societies, among communities, and then to try to start a conversation about how language works in society, how language becomes part of a framework for identity construction that is capable of connecting it to other forms of communication. That is the sort of gist of my talk. So I think most of my research recently has been trying to press this symbolic role of language. And I say, for example, if you go here, let's go to this. If you go here, you don't really need to know what the top line says. You don't need to know what the second line says. You don't need to know what the third line says. As long as you know that the first one is in Latin, the second one is in Arabic, the third one script, Torah script, the last one is Hebrew script, you know that there is some meaning here. And what really matters here at the first level of interaction, that what the eye sees, is that the primary position is given to Hebrew, to English. Why is it given to English? Ask yourself a question. And you say, well, that looks like Arabic. Why does Arabic occur underneath English? Why is it occur on top of Hebrew? So you don't actually sometimes have to access what the language says instrumentally, communicatively, in the linguistic world. What you need to do is to connect it to the extra linguistic world, and then you will start to have layers of meaning, layers of archaeology, as you see, for example, here. There's an archaeology here. You could see that there are two levels. There's one level with Arabic at the top, which is in the middle, and English below it. And then there's another one at the top of the two, which is in Hebrew. And if you go here, there's also an archaeology here. You have Arabic and English, and then there's something missing. You would know that the missing is Hebrew because there is evidence from the city elsewhere that there's a superimposed Hebrew on top of Arabic and English. So who does this? Why do they do it? Is it because they don't like to be told the name of the street in Hebrew? Just because it's Hebrew? Or is it because they're trying to say to the Israeli authorities, this is not your city, you're an occupying power, and we are not going to tolerate symbols of identity from your side in our space. And the Israelis on the other side, I could show you road signs from elsewhere, are doing exactly the same. So what is really at stake here is not the instrumental power of language, but the symbolic meanings of language in the extra linguistic world that really do matter. That's point number one. Point number two is that we don't have to read this as a contest between national movements. And when I gave you the example of Iraqi Jews, Arab Jews, and Ashkenazi Jews, how Arab Jews who like Shanaf calls them Arab Jews and other people, these Jews had Arabic as the only language of their sort of daily lives and even dreaming and everything else. How Arab Jews felt that in order to become fully Israeli, you've got to lose your Arabness, and part of that is losing the language. Although the state itself, which is locked in a deadly war with its neighbors and needs Arabic instrumentally to listen in on the conversations, it is important for its own security, still preferred for that resource to be erased in order to promote something else, which is the identity of the state as a Jewish state. The removal of Hebrew sorry, the removal of the official status of Arabic is not because of instrumental reasons. It's again because of symbolic reasons. So my plea to it is really just, let's all attend to the symbolic meanings of language and read them as ways around which questions of power, questions of domination, questions of resistance, questions of ethnic interactions and inter-ethnic interactions can be read. I think with that I will conclude. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Yasir, for this very insightful, breathtakingly presented intervention. I'll now yield the floor to Sinfree for a couple of questions.
Yes, thanks a lot. I want to start off with something that is rather trivial. What does a recipient of the Order of the British Empire do? I thought they would have given you an award called Recipient for the Disorder of the British Empire.
What do I do?
No. What does what do recipients of the Order of the British Empire do?
To receive one?
Yes.
Oh, I see. So are you thinking of something, Sinfree?
No. What I was thinking was, given the nature of your
I'm just teasing you. I'm teasing you, Sinfree.
No, I know what you mean. Let me follow up the conversation. I'll
answer you if you want, but carry on. Yeah.
Yes, I thought your scholarship undermined the British Empire. So when I realized that you were a recipient of the Order of the British Empire, it came across as something more or less contradictory.
Yeah, it does. It does indeed. I think what when I was offered it, I mean, I didn't. You don't apply. So I didn't apply. Clearly, some people thought that I did something that deserved to be recognized by the state, the Queen. In the citation, they said for services to research.
Okay.
Now, I could have said no, but I decided not to. I think the reason for it is that saying no would have been a momentary something with a momentary impact. But now with this sort of recognition, I think it gives some weight, maybe amongst not amongst people like you, but amongst others, to things that I might want to say. But the other thing is this: is that I joke and I say, isn't it really paradoxical that a member of the old British Empire gets recognized by the now defunct and East British Empire? So when the Queen gave it to me at a time when the British Empire had absolutely no power and no teeth and could do nothing. And therefore, I'm a commander of something that is long dead. So I'm a commander who has nothing to command and has no authority to yield whatsoever. So I actually appeal to my sense of my maybe morbid sense of humor.
Yes.
And so I thought, yeah, I'll just keep it. But if you're asking me to return it, but also what you do, you have I have the right to get my two sons married in Westminster as a good my two sons can get married in the Church of Westminster, where Princess Diana was married. So I thought, oh, why not? I mean, to enter there carrying the Palestinian flag, I think that's, yeah, I mean, that appeals to me a great deal. So I thought, let me just try to subvert and to challenge from the inside rather than just challenging from the outside. Maybe I failed, but I'm getting to write about it in my memoirs, which I'm writing at the moment. So.
Oh, I see. Okay. Make sure that you get an English translation of the memoirs as well. It will be
Yeah, I'm
interesting. They will
writing
be
them in
interesting.
Arabic, but I also turn them into English. I've started
Okay. That's,
about 30,000
yeah.
words.
Simply, if I may, I wonder if Yasir could take down his slide so that we can see the faces.
How do I do
Oh,
this?
So him, I think
There
we go
should
back
be an
to,
option where you can say stop. Oh, I can do it. There we
oh,
go.
great.
okay.
That's
Okay.
fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I want to continue this conversation with Yasir. Let me give you a bit of my own intellectual context. I like your research a lot in terms of how it foregrounds issues about conflict and the tensions in quotes in the real world. Because if you read a sociolinguistics textbook, you'll be forgiven for believing that the world was a very peaceful one. But when you read your work, you are forced to ask a number of questions, such as to what extent are the analytical apparatus that we have in sociolinguistics, to what extent can they deal with issues about conflict? With that in mind, my next question then is this. From a political science perspective, since your work deals with language and conflict, how do you conceptualize conflict? Right. When you are researching conflict, what are the analytical categories that you have, or the categorization that you make that, oh, this is conflict, there's no conflict here, there are degrees of conflict?
That's a great question, Simfree. Now, I mean, there are some people who make distinctions between political conflicts and social conflicts.
Yes.
And so I try to follow mainly political conflicts because
Okay.
and see that the linguistic reflexes of those conflicts, whether sort of between states or inside states.
Yes. Yes.
So one of the things I look at and say, well, there is a conflict in the Middle East involving Israel and Palestine. Is it possible that language might be sort of implicated in this conflict in one way or another? So I begin by saying, well, the Israelis and the Palestinians are not fighting over language.
Yes.
They're fighting over something else. But this fight has some linguistic reflexes. Let's see what these linguistic reflexes are. So that's the starting point. So my starting point is that language is not the cause of conflict.
Okay.
Language is somehow implicated in conflict.
In the conflict.
And it is implicated in two ways. It's implicated instrumentally, and I gave examples of those in code names, and in using, for example, is East Jerusalem, which was occupied in 1967, is it occupied? Is it contested? Is it united? Is it liberated? Is it conquered? Is it, so look at the terminologies used to describe conflict. And in this, I sort of follow Gramsci. Gramsci says when issues of language come to the fore, then there are other more important, not more important, but there are other things that are really in need of attention. So I tend to go to those, what are these other things? But take another example in my book, A War of Words. I can't remember which chapter. I try to look at the work that was done in Arabic sociolinguistics under Labov by Arab PhD students, Palestinians.
Yes.
And they talk about the language situation in Jordan as being controlled, not controlled, but framed by matters by issues of gender and sex.
Yes.
Now, I say, well, really, in 1970, there was a big upheaval in Jordan amongst Palestinians and Jordanians, among the PLO and King Hussein. And let's look at the linguistic reflexes in Jordan. And then when you start to look at this and start to correlate it with other signs of identity, then you realize that this, what has been described in terms of gender is in fact, gender is involved, but there's something overarching, and that's the linguistic identity of the two combatants in this conflict. Another sort of example, just to give another example of how I look at conflicts. You look at the civil war in Lebanon, 1975 to 1992. Now, there are reflexes of conflict in that part of the world. But then there are also subterranean reflexes of conflict. And actually my interest in language and conflict was ignited by my son, who was 5 years old at the time. We used to go to East Jerusalem, stay in the East, but go to the West. It's difficult for those who have been. So the two cities were, between 1948, two parts of the city, 1948 to 1967, were separate. And then the wall that was in the middle was leveled. And then the two cities sort of became physically united. And we used to stay in the East and go to the West every day in order to go to Jaffa, to Tel Aviv, to Haifa on the Mediterranean, to see people and to also look at these places. And one day, and I tell the story, this is really the beginning of my interest in conflict, and really is a very important point for me in my academic career. We used to go up the hill from East Jerusalem to West Jerusalem. And then when we come back, go downhill to go from West Jerusalem to East Jerusalem. And one day, as we were coming downhill from the West to the East, my son, who was 5 years old at the time, said to me, "Dad," I said, "Yes." He said, at some point, he said, "Can we speak Arabic now?" And I said, Tamer, of course you can speak Arabic at any time. My wife said to me, you always jump to ask him, why did he ask you? Why did he ask him why? I said, Tamer, why did you ask me this question? And he said, Dad, I noticed that every day when we come to this point, going from East to West, we switch from Arabic to English. And coming from West to East, at this point, at this place, we start to switch from English, you switch from English to Arabic. And believe me, this was exactly where the wall was in 1967, as I remember it. The wall did not exist in 1995, but in my mind, it was replaced by a linguistic wall. So when I go to the West, I switch to English, and you could say to me, why do you switch to English? The reason why I switch to English, of course, out of necessity, because in the East, Arabic is used, in the West, Hebrew is used. I don't know Hebrew. I could sort of recognize Hebrew. I could sort of hear it, but I don't know Hebrew. But the other reason is this, and this is again out of my living experience, because when I am in Israel, when I am facing Israeli soldiers, I never use Arabic, although they use Arabic with me. I always insist on using English.
Why?
And the reason for that is that I try to analyze my own experience, and that led me to think about autoethnography. My experience is this, is that I don't want to use my native language with people who I think are occupying the land of my fathers. Okay. Secondly, if they use Arabic with me, they're using it from a position of power, right? So I turn to English and I start to use a language of power with these soldiers. So they have the guns, I have the language means, the linguistic means. If you actually record me speaking to them, I don't speak in ordinary sort of English. I start to use highfalutin terms. So if you are, so if you really, and then they just say, what do you mean? What is this? Yes, you could just find them almost going to their telephone, trying to Google the meaning of what does this word mean? And I discovered that I'm saying, okay, you have the guns, I have the linguistic guns. I'm going to use English as a language of power. I'm going to overpower you that way. I'll use hard words so that when you're dealing with me, you're thinking of what I'm saying, and therefore you stop thinking about the gun. And I discovered through, and that again is part of subterranean conflict, how it affects you. So I think so I use autoethnography as one of the categories. I use language as a proxy, language as a means to saying something that goes beyond language. Language is not the cause of conflicts, and therefore I actually disagree with Calvé's language wars. There are,
yes.
And I use those categories. What are the social functions of conflict? Conflict is about borders. It's about us and them, but it's about bounding who are with us to us and bounding who are there. And that is, for example, Yahushua was saying, let the Palestinians write in Arabic and let the Israelis write in Hebrew. He's saying we need to have linguistic borders. We need to know who is with us and who's against us. So all these things come together to allow me to start to question questions of language and conflict.
Now, my next question is this. Other than the Palestinian-Israeli case, in what other context do this complex relationship between symbolic and instrumental functions of language play themselves out? I'm trying to see, for example, to imagine in what other context I could use these particular categories and see what comes out of that analysis.
I don't know Serbo-Croat, but I've been to Bosnia many times. I didn't say that I'm an ambassador of the University of Sarajevo.
Yes.
I mean, an international ambassador of the. So if you go to, for example, that part of the world, you could see that the same sort of notions of conflict stands for something, language conflict stands for something else. It's about us and them. It's not the cause of wars, because what is called Bosnian, what's called Croatian, what's called Serbian are effectively the same language. Right? But now they have been declared to be 3 different languages. So languages are constructed, they are not sort of givens. So to me, language is a very slippery category that needs to be fixed contextually in relation to political, social, historical factors, and then start to relate it to society. So there's conflict there. And then if, for example, you go to Pakistan and India, I think you'll be able to find, if you go to North Africa, in fact, if you go in the past, so this amalgam of notions, which that language is not a source of conflict, but language is implicated. Language is instrumental, but language is symbolic. Language is a proxy. Conflict is about boundaries. It's about us and them. It can be used as a shibboleth to identify who belongs to us and who belongs. For example, in 1975, the start of the Lebanese conflict, Christian Maronite groups used to identify Palestinians by holding a tomato in front of them and saying to them, "What is this?" Both parties speak Arabic, and the Palestinians will say "Bandora," and they say, "Oh, you're Palestinians," because Lebanese would never say "Bandora"; they'll say "Banadora." And then when the Palestinians caught on, and some people actually, when they were identified, they lost their lives, literally lost their lives. So when they, of course, caught on, they knew that when you're asked, you need to assess, is the person asking me one of us or them? And then if it's us, then it's Bandora. If it's them, it's Banadora, right? And these are little examples, but it can, as a set of ideas, I don't actually believe in linguistic theories. I don't believe that I don't believe there are linguistic theories. I think there are linguistic frameworks. And these frameworks consist of certain principles, certain overarching ideas, concepts and methods that go with them, and that then generates questions. Sorry, generates data, not data, information, and that information can then be tested through refutation, through challenging that information. So in that sense, I use the Popperian method. I'm not really so much interested in this sort of where did you get it from? And I say, well, look, I've got you this through this amalgam. Now, can you please test it? And if you have anything that would refute it, then I'm very happy to change my mind about it. So,
okay. Let me ask the last question, then I can give over to Basi and I can come back again. In the Arabic sociolinguistics, how do they respond to your arguments? Because I remember you talking about the way Arabic sociolinguistics carry out their practices as being slightly different from the way you conduct your own research projects. How do they respond to your arguments about symbolic, instrumental aspects of language that the linguistics to some extent has aired by placing too much emphasis on the instrumentality to the neglect of the symbolic and the emblematic? What are their are they able to incorporate that in their own frameworks, or they try and resist your argument?
I think with all, particularly the older generation, with total horror, because I'll tell you for lots of reasons. The first one is that it goes against the way that they have been brought up to do linguistics. So particularly I'm talking about Britain in this case.
Yes.
Now, if you're an Arab linguist, generally you tend to be interested in grammar, and so this is not grammatical. This is not linguistics, sort of linguistics in the way that they understand linguistics. The younger generations are more receptive. I trace references now to my work, and I see the younger ones are picking it up and referring to it. Sometimes they refer to it sort of tokenistically because they think that they ought to, particularly by book The Arabic Language and National Identity, and A War of Words. So I would say that they say, first of all, it is not what we have defined Arabic linguistics to be.
Yes.
This is about something which is not so solid. It's about symbols and constructions and all the rest of it. That is one. Secondly, and very quickly, they think that this brings language close to politics.
Yes.
And to ethnic, so politics, and they don't really want to close to ideology. Ideology is a dirty word. Politics is Middle Eastern politics is full of conflict itself. I'm talking about the study of politics in the Middle East. So they think that it's shifting language, taking language away from linguistics and putting it in a place which is closer to, I think, politics, and therefore making language political. And language is not political. As far as I'm concerned, language is not political, because the phoneme is a phoneme, the morpheme is a morpheme, the clause on the phrasal, they're not political. And there's a third aspect of it, a fourth aspect of it. It is seen as I'm fighting a battle against the establishment. So there's an institutional dimension to it. And some of the enmity that it has generated for me is just incredible, and from two people in particular, because they felt that their positions were undermined. So there's an institutional dimension. There is the way that linguistics is conceptualized, and thirdly, the fact that this takes language away from linguistics, makes it a political object. And mixes it with ideology, and ideology is a dirty word. So all of that comes together, and they think this is. And again, some of them, particularly they get really, I mean, I believe in methodologies. I mean, methodologies are very, very important. Of course, they're very important. But I believe myself that, and I see this amongst younger scholars who have been trained, particularly in the American institutional setting, to write a paper. How do you write a paper? And the paper becomes as a format. So it's almost like a template. And what you do, you say, okay, abstract, literature review, subjects, and then you take SSPS. I supervise 62 students in my life, right? And I've always sent my weakest students to go and do this kind of research. My better students never did it. I say, don't do it. Because the weakest students found a template. They found IT tools that can do quite a lot of work for them. I think one of the worst things that happened to us is the SSPS. Everybody seems to just put in the data, get out the data, and that's it. To me, the data that you get, the conclusions that you get are the beginning of the research, not the end of the research. And some people, they say, oh, well, I'm a Popperian in that sense, in that, but I don't really, there's an unknown element. I don't really mind where you get the information from. You put it to me in a manner in which I can actually question and ask questions of, and in a manner that will not lead to the immunization of the information. The information should never be immunized against falsification. I need to be able to falsify it. And if I fail to falsify it, that's fine by me. Then I'm happy to run with it. So there are all these things that come into it. How the organization of knowledge is handled by institutional setups in which we work.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's a sense in which institutions organize knowledge in such a manner that any creativity is expunged from that knowledge. But let me give it over to you now, and then I can come back if we have any more questions. Yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, thanks a lot again, Professor Suleiman. There's a note of appreciation from Bonnie Norton, who thanks you for a fascinating and important presentation. She cites another example that confirms much of what you've said, and is the example of the potential conflict with the Uyghurs Turkic language and Mandarin. And then Magda is again very grateful to you for the insights you've shared. But perhaps while waiting for other questions, I might just maybe pose this one, whether in very categorical terms, you are willing to assert that the instrumental dimension of language has never been or cannot be a trigger for conflict. I mean, your very interesting analysis, the focus on the symbolic actually makes me wonder now whether there have ever been conflicts that were triggered by language, in spite of however those conflicts may have been referred to. So are there any conflicts, to your knowledge, that have been primarily triggered by language, specifically the instrumental dimension of language?
Categorically, I find it hard to believe that people are going to start to fight over sort of which language they use. They will fight over what the meanings of language choice stand for, but not for the languages as give you an example. When the Yugoslavia started to disintegrate, and then the three combatants, Bosnians, Serbs, and Croats, came together, although they spoke the same language, effectively it was the same language. I'm talking about 1995, 1992, 3, 4, 5. And when they got together, the Croatian side demanded that there be interpreters and interpreters to interpret between the Croatians and the Serbians. I mean, they spoke exactly the same, not exactly, they spoke the same language. One was written in Cyrillic, the other one was written in Latin, but it was spoke Serbo-Croat. I mean, it's the same. Everybody says it's nothing. They said, oh, no, we need interpreters. Now, they were not fighting. I mean, there was a fight, and they brought language into it, and they demanded there be interpreters, not because they didn't understand each other, but because they wanted to construct a wall between them that is linguistically inflected, but it was not really about. So I don't really believe that, unless, for example, a state comes and says, right, we are going to impose this language upon you, and we are going to demand that your language is, but then this is not about instrumentality. I think it's about you are using your power to erase the narrative, the story that our language tells, and you're trying to impose upon us a different narrative through the language that you are requiring us to subscribe to. I mean, I think that is how I read it. So I don't actually believe in language wars, unless you're using the term language war metaphorically to refer to something else. So that's fine. But that's the function of titles as paratext. They do advise, they do this to you. But I don't think, it doesn't mean that languages are not important. I mean, in the United States, the English language only movement, what used to be, it wasn't about language. It was about immigration. Language is not really, I mean, the English language in the United States 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, wasn't really threatened. Nobody believes it is threatened. In fact, I mean, I've written a book, Ashraf knows, and there's a big chapter about 30,000 words on language anxiety. And there's an anxiety over English. The French are anxious because English is dominant and French is not. English is making inroads into French. The English are sometimes anxious because their language, by becoming international, has been hijacked by the Indians and by the Pakistanis, the South Africans and the others. And it's no longer the pure, elegant, aristocratic English so everybody is, so I don't actually believe that language itself is the cause of wars or conflict, but language is implicated, embroiled, brought in, instrumentally to talk about conflict that may involve talk about language, but most of the time it's about the extra linguistic meanings, symbolic meanings, I call them, of language and society, which are political, social, ethnic, historical, religious, and other things.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. I see Rima has hands up. Rima, the floor is yours.
Dr. Suleiman, for this talk. It's really wonderful. I have a comment and a question. First is a comment. I was really impressed when you shared that narrative about you and your son and how that fit into researching this area, especially because I have the same experience. For my dissertation, I also look at language and conflict, but within the US. So my son, I was talking with him, he was sick at the time, and I was talking with him about, his future aspirations and what he wants to be in the future. And I was shocked. He responded to me and said, when I grow up, I don't want to be Arabic. That basically took my interest into language and conflict. But I focus more on how migrant youth negotiate conflict and race within the US, basically. In community schools, or sometimes called complementary schools or heritage schools. So that was my comment. The question to you is, researching this topic, I saw similarities, specifically in terms of how you described food as a symbolism of conflict. For example, my entire first chapter is devoted to how food is used as a pedagogy in this Arabic school. You kind of institute these hours, and it's not not the food that has been claimed by the Israelis. And I guess my question is very specific, but I'm doing a critical ethnography. So a part of it is I need to give back to the community by kind of trying to collaborate with them to develop a pedagogy to deal with these conflicts. And I find myself at loss of where I should start in terms of developing this pedagogy, specifically because I feel like many of the pedagogies that has been talked about, whether it's culturally sustaining pedagogy or difficult knowledge, they're more developed in contexts where it's not complicated by country, whereas in context, I feel even the presence of the pedagogy itself puts this community and these youth at risk of being thought of as as threats to the entire community. So I guess I'm trying to ask is, are you aware of any researchers or any start point for me to start developing what I want to call a conflict pedagogy, basically? Like, how do we help migrant youth who are implicated in conflict make sense of the legacies of conflict and not develop into apolitical subjects that are being silenced by the majority community? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rima. How old is your son? May I ask you?
He's 8 right now, but
8?
Yeah, he's 8, but when he said that, he was 6.
Yeah. Well, don't worry. I think children, when they grow up, they will maybe change. Just getting back, I mean, one of the books I use to talk about conflict is this book. It's a 1950s book, but still a very useful book called The Functions of Social Conflict. It's a very interesting book to read. It's a summary of research, but it hasn't really been surpassed that much since then. Now, as far as what you've talked about is concerned, I don't know about a language sensitive pedagogy. I don't really know. All I know is that if you are sort of thinking about Arabic in the States, I think September 2011, what's it called? 2001, yeah? Has been a very decisive date in the history of the United States of America. Remember that America itself has always ostracized languages at times of conflict. If you go to the First World War, you'll see that how the use of German in German schools was proscribed, and German teachers were prevented from, even some of them were interned. If you go to the Second World War, you'll find the same thing with Japanese. So again, and if you come to the 21st century, Arabic suffered really badly. I don't know whether you must be aware, I'm sure that you're aware of the Khalil Gibran Academy. Yeah, it's quite an interesting experiment. Recently, Debbie Al-Muntasir, that's her book, was just appeared. It's about 2 months old. This book is about leading while Muslim, experiences of American Muslim principles after 9/11. I got it about a week ago because I need it for a chapter in my Arabic book. Ashraf, who is attending, I've a big chapter on language and terrorism, the Arabic language and terrorism. So Arabic in the United States is highly stigmatized, and it's stigmatized differently, believe it or not. If you go to Alabama, or if you go to other places, if you go, for example, to Dearborn, it would be stigmatized along Muslim lines. If you go to New York, it is stigmatized along Arab lines, not Muslim lines. New York seems to be different, from my research anyway, seems to be different because of the ethnic mix of New York City. The ethnic mix is strongly charged with the Arab-Israeli Israeli conflict. So Arabic is seen as the language of the Arabs. And even those who may have something against Arabic as the language of Muslims, they try to not from this and from the other dimension. It is the language of Arab terrorism, not Islamic terrorism. So it's going to be hard for a young kid to want, for example, to be associated with Arabic and Arab culture in that kind of context. I think what is really important is for schools and parents, first of all, parents to get involved in schools, and to make sure that the schools themselves are aware of the need to give their pupils self-respect. And that self-respect extends to offering language teaching and respect for their language. I have in my chapter on language and terrorism interesting sections on what happened in what's the state just outside Washington, where Fairfax is and all this. Do you know?
Virginia.
Virginia, yeah, Virginia. How the Virginia Interfaith Society wanted to say to people Arabic is not a language of terrorism. They mount a campaign on the buses of Virginia, and then every caption in Arabic is associated with translation. And still, people phone FBI, and they demand that the FBI come and look at these things, because these could be hidden messages about bombs that are just about to blow them up on a bus from A to B. So Arabic has a really hard time in the States. It's to do with the political conflict. It's to do with Islam. It's to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. So what do you do about it? I think you need to start from getting involved and not avoiding sort of conflict, but actually bringing the fact of conflict into the school, and then trying to demystify it, to say, well, I mean, there are. You'll have heard of stories of people who had Arabic books with them, were denied travel on airplanes in America, also in the UK, and also in Europe, simply because they had an Arabic book, or they were heard speaking in Arabic. And there are many examples. Ashraf knows that I've given example after example. So Arabic has been conceptualized now as a language of terrorism, as a language of extremism, as a language of a violent religion. And for a kid to have to embrace this language and this culture is going to be very, very hard. So I really don't have much to say apart from, I would say, get involved, but also I mean, I never sort of, we made sure that our children always, they're grown-up men now, in the past, they had always displayed their identity very, very clearly. We would never, for example, use Mo to refer to Muhammad, and Mark to refer to Mahmoud, and no, Mahmoud is Mahmoud and Muhammad is Muhammad. Because once you start to hide your identity through your name, then you somehow lose that sense of self-confidence. And I don't really know. I'm just blabbering on. And I have no answer apart from just sharing with you experiences and what I know of my research.
Well, thank you. That was very useful. I appreciate it.
But have you seen this book? Or?
No, I have not. But I will look at it.
Nabil Muntasir. It's a very disappointing book, I must say, because she was the principal of the Khalil Gibran Academy. And somehow she hardly refers to that chapter, which is really, really very, very disappointing, because I wanted to read about her experience with Khalil Gibran. This is the academy in New York, which was supported to teach bilingual school, Arabic and English, and she lasted in the post as the principal for 8 months. And then after that, she was replaced by somebody who's known for the Zionist views. I'm sorry, I'm not being, but so, I mean, she clearly wants to tackle the issue, but from a distance. She doesn't really want to get involved. And I think we need to get involved.
Okay. All right. There's a question from, from Adrian. Adrian says Jerry Adams was one of the leaders of Sinn Féin, has repeatedly refused to use English when meeting with British leaders at 10 Downing Street. How do you interpret a scenario such as this? Is this a simple political performance or a political claim on the identity of the Irish language?
That's again another great question. I mean, when you look at Irish, you will see that Irish behave in two different ways nowadays. In the Republic of Ireland, Irish is a symbol of identity, a marker of identity, but it has that marker has lost quite a lot of its potency and the fervent sort of support for it that used to be there before the establishment of the Free State in 1922. So when the Irish were fighting for independence against the British, they turned to Irish as something that demarcated them from the British, because they shared with the British the same religion, Catholic and Protestant, right? After independence, we now know that, for example, competence in Irish in the Republic is not as high as it used to be before Ireland became independent in 1922. The Irish script, which was different from the English language script that has been erased now. The Irish have given it up, whereas they used to actually use it in order to signal that although we are writing English, we're not writing in the English of London, we are writing the English of London and Cork and Southern Ireland. So that's where Irish is. So what I want to say here is that when the conflict was at its highest, the potential of language to be used as a very hard demarker of difference was also very, very high. Now that the Irish are part of Europe, they have gained their independence in Southern Ireland. Irish in Southern Ireland doesn't have the same potency as before 1922. If you go to the north, that's a different story. Now in the north, what is called Northern Ireland, Irish is a bone of contention. And recently, there was a big dispute with the nationalists, not the nationalists, but with the Ulster Unionist movement, those who want to remain part of the United Kingdom. They wanted to deny Irish in Northern Ireland the status of an official language. And the British said to them several times, if you do that, we'll just go ahead and then impose a settlement upon you. So if I think Jerry Adams comes to see the Prime Minister, or if he goes to see the Queen, I'm sure he will just greet her initially in Irish. And then after that, he will switch to English. But remember, the English that he would use would be marked as the English of an Irish Republican person, which is different from the English, i.e. what they call the Irish Scots language that is used by the Protestants or by the Unionists, because these two languages, although it's the same language, they're pronounced differently, they're used differently, and you can tell whether a person is a Unionist or a Republican from the way that they use English. For example, a Republican would never refer to Londonderry as Londonderry. For them, it's Derry, it's not Londonderry. So there's no London and Derry, it's just Derry, right? And that's another context in which my ideas actually, Ashraf, I'm sorry to continue to talk to Ashraf, but I gave a talk when I was at the Doha Institute, talking about the Ulster Scots and Irish in Ireland, because my framework applies to it quite neatly. So what I want to say to you is that the battle now inside in Northern Ireland is over Irish on the one hand, but also a recognition of Ulster Scots in an Irish Republican pronunciation is also so the battle in Northern Ireland is really, and the Northern Irish are not really asking for Irish to become dominant or anything. They just want a symbolic recognition of that part of the citizenry of Northern Ireland to be seen as a separate national community inside Northern Ireland. Yeah.
Okay.
I should perhaps, one day give you a talk on Ulster Scots and Irish, because that's also, because I'm interested in the applicability of my framework to other places. So wherever there's a conflict that I can access, actually in 2004, 2003, when I was writing A War of Words, my copy editor that Cambridge assigned to me was Southern African. She was in South Africa. And she was so interested because she provided me with so many examples. She said, this is not very different from what we have here in South Africa. This is really very much like, and she was giving me example after example. And she was she's even stopped working as a copy editor, and she started she started to become an interlocutor. I said, look, Mary, her name was Mary. I said, Mary, I want to get rid of this book. But also, let me give you an example of how. Now, I used to live in Edinburgh, in Scotland, and they opened a museum, a new museum, which is an extension of the Royal Scottish Museum. And this museum was called the Museum of Scotland. Now, the two are adjacent to each other, and they're in a very important part of the town. And when they came to open it, there was a big debate whether you come to the museum through the Royal Scottish Museum and then walk to the Scottish Museum, or you come to it from the outside separately. So they had, the British are good at finding, compromise solutions. So you could either walk from through the main Royal Museum, or you can come from the street straight away and just go into the Scottish Museum without seeing the Royal Museum. Now, when it opened, people just flocked to see it. And we also went to see it. And one Sunday afternoon or Saturday afternoon, I can't remember, when we went to look at the museum, there was this long, long, long line. And I said, why is it there's a long line? So when we got to the desk, I just realized what the long line was about. So they would give you these machines that, I don't know what they call them, but machines that you put, and then they will just walk you through the museum and tells you about every object, right? And then when I came and said, yeah, and she said, I said, can I have 3 of these machines or 4? Because my 2 sons and my wife. And she said, of course, yes. And she said, which language? I said, what? And I said, which language? I said, English. I thought, initially I said Arabic. Initially I said Arabic. She said, oh, we don't have Arabic. French, German? I said, no, Arabic. She said, no Arabic. I said, English in that case. So she went and took these machines and she started to program them. And she came and gave them to me. And I said, it took her about a minute or 2. I said, what did you do? A minute. She said, oh, I was changing the default setting from Gaelic to English. And I said, so the default setting is in Gaelic. She said, yes, it is the ancient language of Scotland, which is related to Irish. It's the sister language of Irish and Welsh. So these machines were in Gaelic, then you turn them into English. And the long queue was because every time they've got to go and program the machines to go to English. And I said to her, how many people today have asked for Gaelic? She said, I've been on shift for 2 hours, only 2 people. But they felt, the Scots felt very strongly that this machine the default setting on this machine has to be in a language that very, very few people use and understand. So it wasn't about instrumentality. It's not because there are lots of people who would demand it. No? They were saying, this is our Scottish National Museum. It's going to be in our national language, which very few people speak and know, and that is Gaelic. Now, you know, when you say that to a linguist who deals with morphemes and phonemes and all the rest of it, right? They start to laugh at you and say, ah, these are silly Scots. Whereas if they were in Africa or the Middle East, they'll say, ah, these stuff, they're not silly. It's a bloody, you know, no. It's a question of who we are, what stands, you know, what represents us in the language world and in this. So I could give you many, many examples of this case, of this situation. Just
okay. All right. Thanks. I mean, that raises the issue of a trade-off between symbolism and economics, but we won't talk about that now. Let's go over to Musna, who has a question for you.
Hi, مرحبا Dr. Suleiman. I'm Musna and I'm speaking to you today from Tarshiha, next to... Hi. Yeah, so I'm also talking from the Galilee. And thank you for a fascinating talk. So I have a question. I'm an applied linguist and I study the way Palestinians navigate between English, Hebrew, and Arabic in the English as a foreign language classroom. And in fact, I'm interested in how the political conflict-ridden educational context imposes a kind of a linguistic behavior on the Palestinians who study in a segregated schooling system, basically. So Palestinians study in a schooling system of their own, where where Arabic is the language of instruction, even though it was demoted by the nation-state law in 2018. So I wonder, to what extent do you think what's happening in the last few years following the nation-state law regarding the grassroots, or if we can talk about the on-the-ground or the de facto practices of the Palestinians with regard to Arabic, to what extent can we talk about this as kind of constructing new frameworks of voice, where Palestinians start maybe to demand or to contest the imposed language policy that has been imposed on them, you know, following the nation-state law. So for example, I have been researching the way Palestinian schools have been implementing new language policies in their schools, where they celebrate peak days of the Arabic language, or they organize Arabic teachers in forums that are not, you know, under the supervision of the Israeli Ministry of Education, in order to fortify their connection and their symbolic identity as Arabic speakers and as Palestinians. So to what extent do you think that we are experiencing, or that we are witnessing, an emergence of a new kind of linguistic movement, if I can put it in this way, or a new linguistic practice that should capture our attention as applied linguists or as sociolinguists?
I mean, thanks, Musna. I think your last name must be Bishara.
Yeah, Awayed, the first name, and Bishara is the marital name. Yeah, Bishara.
Well, the reason for it is that you know, I know Bishara, and
yeah, it's the same. Yeah, the family that you are acquainted with. Yeah.
That's right. Okay.
And it's nice to meet you finally.
Nice to meet you. And I've been to Tarshiha so many times. I mean, it's the most beautiful village. It's not a village, it's a town. Well, Muslim, I don't really know what. I think the Palestinians have been demanding cultural rights for some time. They have used that right in very clever ways because they know that Palestinians inside Israel demanding political rights is going to be it's not going to be an easy thing. So ask for cultural rights, and particularly language rights. But they are also, I think the Palestinians are aware that culture is political. And therefore they're resorting to culture in order to press their own cultural identity, their own rootedness in the land, their also unboundedness as a national minority. I think the Palestinians, for example, after 1948, the Palestinians were called Israeli Arabs. They were not Palestinians, and then they became, and then, you know, so now the Palestinians are Palestinians. They're Palestinians in Israel. Israeli. So I think, I mean, I haven't been to where you are for some time now, about 3 years now. So I don't really know what's happening. But I think you will find that when there's action, there'll always be a reaction. The Palestinians inside Israel have found a voice. They're no longer the Palestinians of 1948. There are new cultural centers emerging amongst, you know, for them. Haifa has become a cultural capital of Israel for Palestinians. And language is a part of that. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if avenues of the kind that you've talked about have been emerging. But language, the Arabic was. Have you ever read النضال الصامت لصالح برانسي مزنا? This is an oral history book, very, very short book. It's quite interesting, where Salih Baransi, I don't know whether this has started to emerge or not amongst Palestinians in Israel, where Salih Baransi uses the linguistic terminology of the Arabic language, Arabic grammar, in order to talk about occupation and occupier and occupied. And he does this with kana wa akhawata and inna wa akhawata. Quite an interesting one. But I would imagine that the cultural sort of, I mean, you have newspapers now in Arabic, you have radio in Arabic, there are writers who are writing in Arabic, Ala Ihlihil and others. There's also a theater movement in Arabic. There are sort of, so although Arabic has lost its the symbolic official status, for the Arabs in Israel, is still the national language. And they'll find ways of expressing it. And I think they're doing it very cleverly because they know that the state can be oppressive and can be hard in dealing with expressions of alternative, challenging political identity. So they're doing it, but the state does read it as political. It doesn't read it as just purely culture. And anyway, Azmi's project of, you know, cultural autonomy for the Arabs in Israel, for the Palestinians in Israel, is really a hugely political project. And that's why they opposed it. Mm-hmm. And he said, no, it's just culture, but he knew what he was doing. He was saying culture is political. And we want to, so it is, language becomes, as an entitlement, a question of entitlement and right, becomes politicized in ways that, so Arabic language in Israel is highly politicized in ways that the Arabic language is not politicized in Jordan or in Syria or in other places. In North Africa, it's politicized, but not in the Gulf, for example. It's not really hugely politicized. Whereas in Israel, it is hugely politicized. But you are, you know, you can give me the answer because you are on the ground.
Yeah, I'll share with you some of my insights later because I don't want to take much time of this gathering. Yeah, but I just want to make like a very short comment and saying that it seems like, you know, I was thinking about Aleph Yeshua's response to Anton Shammas's writing in Hebrew, but it seems that, you know, Palestinians are reverting to Hebrew or to English in many cases also. In order to speak back to continuous attempts to silence them in Arabic. So it seems that it's fascinating to look what's happening between the languages that they use in order to speak against these continuous and long-standing attempts of the Israeli Institute to silence their voices and to silence their identity. So that I will share with you some of the insights that I gained.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I look forward to that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a fascinating talk. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, well, on this lovely note, I think we should be drawing the curtain on a most exciting, 2 hours already with Professor Yasir Suleiman. Thank you so very much for sharing your expertise, your insights with us. I'm sure we'll go back to our desks.
There's a question
from
Michelle Krebs.
Beg your pardon?
So there's a hand up. So.
Oh, is that a hand up?
I think so.
I think there is somebody.
Oh, I can't.
I was just clapping my hands.
Oh, okay. Chanel was clapping.
Oh,
no, there was
okay.
a hand. There is a hand up. Michael had his hand up. Michael has had his hand up.
Okay, Michael.
Good. Thanks, but I was basically also just applauding and saying thanks. So I was not.
Okay.
Oh, okay. All right. So maybe we might just all clap at the same time. Thank you so very much, Professor Yasir Suleiman. And Kim, would you be so kind as to tell us who our next guest